The studio lights cast a warm glow over the glossy stage as the cameras rolled, capturing the moment in perfect clarity. The audience sat in quiet anticipation, waiting for the interview to begin. Seated in the center of it all was Melania Trump, poised and elegant, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had done media appearances before, but tonight felt different. There was an unspoken energy in the air, the kind that hinted at something more than just a casual conversation. Across from her, the TV host adjusted their microphone, a practiced smile stretching across their face. They were known for pushing boundaries, for asking the kind of questions that made headlines the next morning. And tonight, their target was sitting right in front of them. After a brief introduction, the host wasted no time getting to the heart of the interview. The opening questions were predictable: her life after the White House, her work, her future plans. Melania answered each one with grace, her voice calm, her demeanor unwavering. She was used to this, used to being analyzed, scrutinized, and dissected by people who had never met her. Then the shift happened. The host leaned forward slightly, their tone taking on a sharper edge. "Melania, let's be honest," they said, their words slow, deliberate. "Many people have said that your biggest role in history was simply standing next to your husband, that you were never more than a trophy wife." A murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of gasps and hushed whispers. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. It wasn't just a question, it was a statement disguised as one, designed to catch her off guard, to make her stumble. For a moment there was silence. The host watched her carefully, waiting for a reaction, perhaps a flicker of annoyance, a defensive response, maybe even an awkward laugh, but Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she let the moment stretch, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady. Then, ever so slowly, she smiled. It wasn't forced, wasn't rushed, just a quiet, knowing smile. And then she spoke. "Is that what people say?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled. "Or is that just what you want to believe?" The audience went silent. The host blinked. They hadn't expected that. The host's smile faltered just for a second, as Melania's words settled in the air. The audience, sensing the shift, leaned in slightly, waiting for what would happen next. The host recovered quickly, forcing a small chuckle, as if trying to brush off the moment. "Well," they said, crossing their legs and tilting their head, "it's not about what I believe, it's about public perception." Melania's expression didn't change. She remained poised, her gaze steady. "Public perception," she repeated, as if tasting the words, letting them linger. "Tell me, have you ever met someone and truly understood them in the first 5 minutes?" The host hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, no, of course not," they admitted. Melania nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "Then why do people believe they understand me when they have never spoken to me?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The question wasn't defensive, nor was it aggressive. It was logical, simple, and yet it carried weight. The host shifted slightly in their chair, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But surely you understand why people say these things," they pressed. "Your background, your marriage, it's all been under a microscope." Melania tilted her head slightly, studying them. "Yes," she agreed, "but under a microscope, people only see what they want to see, not what is real." The air in the studio changed. The audience, who had been expecting a different kind of exchange, perhaps an awkward moment, maybe even defensiveness, was now watching something entirely different unfold. The host hesitated, their carefully planned angle slipping away. "So, what is real?" they asked, attempting to regain control. Melania took a slow breath, then said, "I know who I am. I know what I have done, what I have built, and what I stand for, and I do not need to explain my worth to those who have already decided I have none." The room fell silent. Even those who had come in skeptical of her were now listening differently. The host blinked, their carefully prepared questions suddenly feeling inadequate. The audience, quiet just moments ago, suddenly erupted into applause. Not the kind that was forced or expected, but the kind that came from people who had just realized they had underestimated someone. Melania sat still, the smallest hint of a smile on her lips. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. And yet, she had just taken control of the entire conversation. The applause faded, but the energy in the room had shifted. Melania sat calmly, her expression unchanged, while the host straightened in their seat, clearly re-evaluating their approach. This was not going as planned. They had expected hesitation, an awkward pause, something they could latch onto. Instead, she had turned the moment around, leaving them scrambling to regain footing. The host cleared their throat, forcing a small smile. "That's a very diplomatic answer," they said, trying to inject some control back into the exchange. "But surely you can understand why people are curious. You were married to one of the most powerful men in the world. Some would say that's why your voice was ever heard at all." Melania met their gaze without hesitation. "And do you believe that?" The question was unexpected, sharp in its simplicity. The host hesitated, their carefully constructed confidence cracking just slightly. They started, then stopped. The moment stretched just a second too long. The audience caught it. Melania caught it. She didn't let them off the hook. "It is easy to dismiss someone when you assume they have only stood in another's shadow," she continued, her tone smooth, unwavering. "But do you know my story? Have you ever taken the time to learn what I have done?" The host opened their mouth, then closed it again. For the first time it was clear. They didn't really know. Melania continued, her voice calm. "I have worked for everything I have. I have learned different languages, built a career, and taken my own path. I was not waiting for anyone to give me value. I created my own." The audience murmured, absorbing her words. Some nodded, others looked at each other, realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had misjudged her. The host, realizing they were losing control, gave a tight smile. "That's fair," they conceded. "But surely you can acknowledge that your life has been different because of your marriage." Melania tilted her head slightly. "Of course," she said simply. "But should a woman's worth be measured only by the man she marries?" The audience reacted instantly. Another round of applause, this time louder, stronger. The host shifted again, looking down at their notes, but the moment was already lost. Melania wasn't just responding, she was leading. The host let out a small, controlled laugh, attempting to mask the tension creeping into their posture. "That's an interesting perspective," they said, flipping to a new page of notes as if looking for a different approach. "But let's talk about influence. Many people believe that, as First Lady, you didn't use your platform as effectively as others before you. Do you think you could have done more?" Melania sat still, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't rattled. She had been asked versions of this question before, always laced with the same suggestion that she had been silent, passive, somehow absent. She took a moment before responding. "Everyone has their own way of making an impact," she said. "Some choose to make noise, others choose to take action quietly." The host leaned forward. "So, you believe your work spoke for itself?" Melania nodded. "I believe that kindness and influence do not need to be loud to be meaningful. I worked on initiatives that mattered to me, not to get attention, but to help people." The audience listened closely. This wasn't a defensive response. It was measured, deliberate. The host, still trying to regain control, offered a skeptical smile. "But do you think history will remember your time in the White House as impactful?" Melania's lips curved slightly, not in amusement but in quiet confidence. "History remembers the truth," she said, "not headlines." The audience murmured in response. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift, a realization. The host, sensing the energy change, tried again. "But surely, being First Lady came with responsibility. Some say you could have been more vocal, taken a stronger stance on certain issues." Melania tilted her head slightly. "And what would you have liked me to say?" The host hesitated. The question caught them off guard. Melania continued. "Would you have been satisfied if I had spoken louder, or would you have criticized me for speaking at all?" Silence. The audience understood what she meant. No matter what she had done, there would always be critics. And yet, she had chosen to stay true to herself. The host, flipping through their notes once again, seemed to realize something. They weren't the ones leading this conversation anymore. Melania was. The host shifted in their seat, feeling the momentum slip further out of their hands. They had come prepared with a strategy, with sharp questions meant to control the narrative, but now they were grasping. Melania wasn't just answering, she was redirecting. The silence stretched for a moment longer than intended, and the host hurried to fill it. You've always been very private, and some would say that's why people don't really know you. Don't you think that silence left room for assumptions? Melania took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slightly. Perhaps, she said. But assumptions are made whether you speak or not. People hear what they want to hear, and when they do not have the full story, they create their own. The host's smile tightened. So, do you think the public has been unfair to you? Melania tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then she responded with something unexpected. I think people see what they are told to see. A murmur rippled through the audience. The weight of her words hung in the air. The host leaned forward again, trying to push just a little harder. So, you're saying the media has shaped the way people view you? Melania's gaze didn't waver. Of course, she said simply. That is their job. The host blinked. They had expected a denial, a defensive reaction. Instead, Melania acknowledged it without hesitation. She continued, her voice steady. Every public figure is portrayed a certain way. Some are made heroes, some are made villains. But the truth is always somewhere in between. The room felt different now. People weren't just watching a typical interview. They were watching something real, something unpolished yet controlled. The host exhaled, regrouping. Then, what do you want people to know about you? Melania held their gaze. That I am not defined by what others think I am. The response was simple, but it landed heavily. The audience, silent for most of the exchange, responded again, this time with another round of applause. Longer, louder. The host, feeling the tide of the conversation shift beyond repair, flipped through their notes once more, realizing there was no question left that could shake her. Melania wasn't just handling the interview, she was owning it. The host forced a small chuckle, as if trying to shake off the moment, but it was clear to everyone watching. This interview wasn't going the way they had planned. Melania sat with the same composed expression she had carried from the beginning, never raising her voice, never letting the pointed questions unnerve her. She wasn't reacting, she was responding, and there was a difference. The host glanced at the camera before shifting in their chair. You've been in the public eye for so long, yet people still say they don't really know you. Why do you think that is? Melania took a brief pause before answering. Because I do not seek attention. The response was so direct, so effortless, that the audience murmured again. The host nodded, waiting for her to continue. She did. In today's world, people believe you must share everything. Your thoughts, your feelings, your private life, to be seen as real. But I do not believe in speaking just to be heard. The host frowned slightly. So, you don't think people deserve to know who you really are? Melania let a small smile tug at the corner of her lips. The people who matter know who I am. The audience reacted immediately, some nodding, others exchanging glances. It wasn't arrogance in her tone, but certainty. The host, sensing the weight of her words, quickly moved on. But don't you think being silent allows people to control your story? Melania's expression didn't change. People will control the story no matter what you say, she answered. I choose what is worth my time. The room was silent again, except for a few scattered claps from the audience. The host inhaled sharply, glancing down at their notes, clearly realizing that every attempt to corner her had only led to her turning the conversation back in her favor. Melania, meanwhile, sat comfortably, unfazed. She had spent years being misunderstood, mischaracterized, yet here she was, not defending herself, not explaining herself, just being herself. The host hesitated before speaking again, as if realizing they were no longer conducting an interview but witnessing something bigger. Melania had not just changed the course of the conversation. She had changed the way people were listening. The host sighed, shifting in their chair as if trying to reset the rhythm of the conversation. They had started with control, with carefully structured questions designed to challenge, maybe even rattle, Melania Trump. But now, they were the ones searching for footing. Melania, meanwhile, remained still, poised, unmoved by the subtle tension in the room. She had spoken her truth, not in anger, not in frustration, but in quiet, unshakable confidence. And that had proven to be far more powerful than any dramatic response could have been. The host laced their fingers together, forcing another smile. "Well," they said, their tone lighter now, an attempt to soften the edges of an interview that had become something far more than they had intended. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting some of your answers tonight." Melania offered a polite nod. "That is because you expected to hear what you already believed." A few gasps rippled through the audience. The host blinked. The remark wasn't hostile, but it was piercingly honest. The host exhaled. "Maybe you're right," they admitted, shifting slightly in their seat. "But don't you think that's part of the problem? That people don't take the time to see the full picture?" Melania studied them for a moment before responding. "It is not just me," she said. "People do this to everyone. They decide who someone is before ever meeting them. They listen not to understand, but to respond." The room fell silent again. The host tilted their head, taking in her words. "And how do we change that?" Melania gave a small, thoughtful smile. "By choosing not to be like them." For a moment, the host had no response. The audience, silent at first, erupted into applause once more. Not out of politeness, not because they felt obligated, but because they understood exactly what she meant. The host let out a breath, almost as if they had been holding it. They looked at Melania with something different now. Not scrutiny, not skepticism, but something closer to respect. This wasn't just another media interview, this was something real. And by now, it was clear. Melania Trump had not come to prove anything. She had simply come to remind people that she never had to. The studio lights reflected off the sleek desk between them, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as an attempt to put Melania Trump on the spot had turned into something entirely different. The host, who had once led the conversation with calculated confidence, now sat quieter, more measured. Melania hadn't just answered the questions. She had dismantled the assumptions behind them, and she had done it without raising her voice, without trying to prove anything, without allowing herself to be boxed into the narrative that had been placed before her. The host cleared their throat, glancing at the camera before returning their gaze to her. "I have to say, I don't think this interview went how many people expected." Melania's lips curved into the smallest smile. "That is the problem with expectations." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience. It wasn't laughter at her expense. It was admiration. She had not only controlled the conversation, she had rewritten its entire direction. The host leaned back slightly, taking a breath. "Before we wrap up, I have to ask, if you could say one thing to those who think they already know everything about you, what would it be?" Melania paused for just a moment, letting the question settle. Then, with the same poise she had carried throughout the evening, she responded, "I would say nothing." The host frowned slightly. "Nothing?" She nodded. "Because those who want to know me will listen, and those who do not will never hear me anyway." The silence that followed was heavier than any moment before. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore. They were watching a shift in perception, a realization that the woman before them was not the one they had been told to expect. The host let out a slow breath, then finally spoke. "Well, Melania, I think a lot of people are listening now." The interview ended, the cameras cut, and the audience erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, not the expected kind, but the kind that comes when people realize they have just witnessed something undeniable. By morning, the world would be talking about this moment, but Melania Trump wouldn't need to say another word. She had already said everything that mattered. This wasn't just an interview. It was a reminder that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing who you are, even when others try to define you. Next time someone underestimates you, pause, smile, and remind them your worth isn't up for debate.